Testing. Thumbs up. Thumbs up if you're with us at America's All In.
All right.
All right.
Both of us?
Welcome.
Awesome.
Okay, great. Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to our panel this afternoon on Rethinking Decision Making in Sustainable Energy Investments. My name is Laura Tierney. I'm Vice President of the Business Council for International. Oh, no, that's not right. Business Council for Sustainable Energy. Vice President of International Programs. Woohoo! If you're not familiar with the BCSE, we are a multi-sector clean energy trade association headquartered in Washington, D.C., and we have been an accredited business observer here before the UNFCCC since our founding in 1992. The mission of our coalition is to advocate for and implement policies and regulations that reduce pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, develop and deploy a broad portfolio of existing sustainable energy technologies solutions. Here at COP29, BCSE is calling for countries to make more ambitious NDCs, national climate targets, and to mobilize greater financial flows as they work towards achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement. We are also here to make the business case for climate action. A key component of that is public-private partnerships, sharing what that means, working with governments, working with stakeholders, which brings us to our support and involvement with the America's All In Coalition for the past 8 years. We are grateful for their partnership and the opportunity to host an event in a home that is focused on the front lines of action and leadership by our subnational actors. So to begin today's program, we are so pleased to have with us Brendan Owens, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy, Installations and Environment, and the Chief Sustainability Officer and the Chief Housing Officer at the U.S. Department of Defense. In his role, he is the Principal Advisor to the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment to all matters related to operational and facility energy. Installations, real property planning, operations and sustainment, environment protection, compliance and restoration, natural, historical and cultural resources, and accompanied and unaccompanied military housing. He oversees the Department of Defense's real property portfolio encompassing millions of acres and over 500,000 buildings and structures and more than 500 installations. We are so pleased to have the Assistant Secretary here today to kick off our discussion that will explore why it is important to take a broader view of the benefits of investments in sustainable energy and perhaps shed some light into other factors that are considered when making these decisions, including climate, security, resilience, and the like. So, Assistant Secretary, welcome.
Thanks very much. And I appreciate the opportunity to share a little about what DoD is doing and how we think about these issues, because there is a significant nexus between what the military department needs from a readiness perspective and the work that is happening in halls like this year over year. The panel that I have the privilege of being the lead-in, the kickoff for, is focused on integrative climate-informed decision-making, right? So I think what you'll hear out of all of us, I hope, is that the climate mitigation and adaptation work that we were doing has a common thread in terms of how we go about doing this. And while we have unique perspectives, and DoD's is about as unique as you can get in terms of the way that we look at our response to mitigation and adaptation to climate threat. What I hope that you'll hear from the rest of the panel is that we are all looking at this in a very integrated and holistic way. So I will primarily be talking about our installation work, the 500,000 buildings that DoD is responsible for stewarding and making sure are efficient and climate resilient. But I want to share a little bit of an anecdote on the cost of inaction from a readiness perspective. Readiness is a theme that you'll hear layered throughout the remarks that I'm making, because mission is central to everything that we do. And the anecdote that I want to share is sort of centered in that idea of readiness and capability being degraded by climate change. So a study that was released last year looked at the military capability associated with the transport capacity of the C-17 Globemaster. So the C-17 Globemaster is the backbone of the United States Strategic Airlift. These giant planes are operated by the Air Force, and they are they make it possible for DoD to execute its mission from a strategic airlift perspective, and that is both from a warfighter perspective, but also from a humanitarian aid and disaster response perspective. C-17 is a significantly important, maybe the significantly important strategic airlift capability in DoD. And the study that was released last year basically said, look, because of climate-induced warming and because of the aerodynamics associated with warmer air, in 2039, the lift capacity, the cargo capacity of a C-17 could be degraded by as much as 8.5%, right? So if we round that up to an even 10, that is one more trip that's necessary for every 10 missions we fly, or 9 missions that we fly. And that creates a pretty vicious feedback loop, right? Because when you set up more planes in the air, that's more emissions, which means more warming, which means less lift, less capacity, which means more planes, which means more fuel, which means more warming, which means less lift, which means less capacity. And this feedback loop, right, is self-reinforcing. So that capability degradation is the type of thing that animates the climate response that DoD is responsible for, making sure that our warfighters have what they need to be the credible deterrence and be the humanitarian aid and disaster response force that the world has come to rely on, and both domestically and internationally. So as we talked about, DoD's portfolio is large and diverse. We have buildings in all climate zones everywhere, and we have operational requirements that means that dictate that our buildings have to be in climate vulnerable locations, right? You cannot park a submarine in Nebraska, right? It's got to be on an ocean. Right now, Nebraska, maybe we'll see in the future, right? But our ability to execute our mission in these climate vulnerable locations means that we have to have an adaptation strategy as a result of that. And Navy is particularly challenged by the fact that they have to be close to the ocean to execute their mission. So our vulnerability to the extreme weather and the extreme weather that we are increasingly experiencing creates mission risk across our entire portfolio. That can manifest as a hurricane that wipes out Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida and costs DoD $5 billion. It can be flooding in Offutt Air Force Base that costs DoD $1 billion. So all of these things are realities that our mission is at risk because of. And the adaptation that we are implementing in response to those challenges comes in a bunch of different forms, but I'll focus on a couple just for the sake of because as we talked about, our portfolio is huge to the point of being absurd. So I'll focus on a couple installation-specific ones that I want to touch on that are relevant to what's going on inside these pavilions over the course of the next week and a half. Because while they are talked about in these places as climate responsive technologies and strategies, where we talk about them inside the Pentagon as readiness enhancement and mission enhancement. So I'll start with electrification of our buildings. We signed policy last year that said all DoD buildings going forward are going to be all electric, and that everything that we do to retrofit an existing building is going to go on the normal business cycle of when those systems fail, they will move to all electric systems, right? So that electrification strategy is the starting point of making sure that we are leveraging the investments that we are making in microgrids on our installations to be able to leverage that microgrid architecture to its fullest extent, right? And what I mean by that is that we are investing in electrifying our buildings, creating the connective tissue through the microgrid that will allow us to be able to access the battery storage in the electric vehicles that we are deploying on our installations, and wheel power back and forth when the civilian power grid is disrupted, whether that is cyber, kinetic, or natural disaster driven, right? So as we electrify our non-tactical vehicles, there's more and more storage that we have access to, which creates resilience and enhances readiness in ways that our existing internal combustion engine fleet just doesn't give us the ability to do. So all of the mission-facing requirements that we are responsible for making sure that we execute are enhanced by the quote-unquote, in these halls, climate-related work that we are doing, but it is being driven inside DoD as a response to and a need for readiness and resilience that is connected directly back to the mission. The other things that we're doing is looking outside the fence line. We've done a very good job of looking at looking inside our fence lines and creating cyber and kinetic and logistics tail-free energy resources inside our fence line. But 70% of the people who work on a DoD installation live in the defense community that surrounds it. So we need to make sure that we understand their role in the mission, because if they can't get to work, then our mission is degraded. So we are increasingly looking at installation level energy assets that also support defense community infrastructure and make sure that when the lights are on the installation, the lights are on in the defense community. And there's a bunch of churn around that electricity, around water security, and around cyber as well, telecom as well. So I think it's important, again, to stress that while in venues like this, we talk about those as climate solutions, they are readiness and resilience enhancing within DoD. And I'll come back to that in a second. But the other thing that we are doing is looking at all the investments that we are making through the lens of how it supports the people that do our mission. All of the things that we are doing to electrify our buildings and electrify our vehicles have regional air quality benefits that we understand to manifest as a healthier workforce. Our workforce is self-insured. Our military members the healthcare is paid for by the Department of Defense, so anything that we can do to make them healthier is less of a burden on the military health system. We recognize that, and that's animating a significant amount of efforts around making sure that the health and well-being is another lens through which readiness is enhanced through these quote-unquote climate solutions that are here. So I want to come back to the thing that I said about the fact that we are linking these two things together, climate resilience and mission readiness, because the election last week is a challenging thing for the federal government leadership around these issues. We see various things being said about whether or not the United States will be in the Paris Agreement going forward or not. But I have faith that within the Department of Defense, all of the things that we are doing to increase readiness, to increase resilience, that have climate co-benefits will endure, because we are giving capability to installation commanders, to combatant commanders, to war fighters that they are enhanced by. And because of that, our credibility as a deterrence force, our ability to respond in all of these places where we need to respond is enhanced. And when we start taking that away from our warfighters, I think they're going to have a thing to say about that. So I really do believe that the work that we're doing, while the vocabulary that we're using is different than the vocabulary that is used in places like this, there is a significant interconnection that's inextricably linked. We're looking at two sides of the same coin here, and my hope is that our ability to continue to tell that message within the Department of Defense will be met with the type of enthusiasm that we're seeing from the people who actually execute the mission, and because of that, they will continue to demand DoD do more in this space. So I will leave it there. Hopefully that is a note of optimism to end on, and turn it over to these other great folks, who I'm really eager to put headphones on and listen to.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your remarks.
Right on. Thanks, y'all.
I'd like to invite our panel up. Okay, now on to our panel. So let me set the stage. Why are we here today? Most everyone could probably agree that there is tremendous potential and opportunity for greater investment in energy efficiency and renewable energy, and yet it is not always or often prioritized by decision makers. Why is this? Why are we not thinking about the readiness and resilience of our communities and our work environments and our operations in the same way as the DoD? But how can we unlock a lot of this existing but untapped potential for investment? So, to better help us understand this dilemma and this opportunity, we have this great panel that is a cross-section of America's All-In Coalition leaders from the public sector, finance, and corporate sector as well. So, welcome to Bob Hinkle, to my left, President and CEO of Metris Energy, Mayor Hollis Winston of the City of Brooklyn Park in Minnesota, and Kevin Rabinovich, Vice President, Sustainability and Chief Climate Officer at Mars. So for the first question, I'm just going to go down the row, ask you to tell us who you are, what your role and perspective is to bring into this panel, and your initial thoughts on how sustainable energy investments are being made. So Bob, will you like to kick us off?
Yeah, so Bob Hinkle with Metris Energy, and Metris has been a member of the America's All-In Coalition since 2018, and it was important then, and obviously in the post-election environment now, it's even more important, so we're proud to be here. Metris is a developer, financer, and an owner of large-scale energy efficiency and sustainable energy projects. We finance and implement projects for large commercial and industrial customers, universities and colleges, and hospitals. Under our Energy as a Service financing solution, we fund 100% of the upfront cost of a project. We own the energy assets, and then we bill customers based on the performance of the project. And the performance of the project can mean different things and different outcomes and for different types of projects. So for energy efficiency projects, we're billing customers based on realized energy savings. For sustainable cooling and heating projects, we're billing customers based on available cooling or heating capacity or delivered thermal energy. And for renewable energy generation projects, it's the generation of clean kilowatt hours. So to the topic of the panel, and something that we see every day in our business, is that the capital budgeting playbook, and by that I mean the investment decision-making process that companies and organizations use to decide to implement an energy efficiency project at their site or implement an on-site renewable project, really doesn't work for sustainable energy projects. These projects, the benefits that are within them, are often undervalued or discounted, and rarely, if ever, is the cost of inaction from not doing these projects considered in the investment decision-making process. So the result is that there are trillions of dollars of energy upgrade projects that are out there ready to go today that have GHG reduction benefits, that help with resiliency, that save money, that provide health and productivity benefits, but they go undone. And I know this is the Finance COP and today is Energy Day, and there's a lot of talk of accessing private capital, and it's critical, but part of the challenge is that there are projects out there that organizations, businesses, hospitals, schools, aren't thinking about, I think, in the multifaceted benefit way that's required for these types of projects, and changing that is critical to getting some movement.
Thank you, Bob. Mayor?
So hi, Hollis Winston, Mayor of the wonderful city of Brooklyn Park. I want to thank you all for having me. Just for some context, our city is located in the state of Minnesota. We're about 90,000, fifth largest. We've got a ton of diversity, which for Minnesota, if you know Minnesota, that's a little bit rare. We're about 60% people of color, 25% immigrant, actually. in our city, and I'll come back around to why that's important, even within the course of this discussion particularly. But I'm not here representing myself, just myself, or my city or state of Minnesota. We are also here with, there's a few of us here with Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative, and so they are a consortium of about 105 mayors through 10 states along what we call, when we were growing up, we called it the mighty Mississippi. I don't know if folks do that anymore, but it's an important river. When we think about it, 40% of our country's food production. We feed about 1 in 12 people around the entire country. About $1 trillion of just trade goes out that port in New Orleans. So it's an incredibly important port, but we've seen a lot of degradation along the way. So we were put together as a consortium for that. I think when we specifically talk about the topic at hand, I think to kind of address a little bit of what Assistant Secretary Owen said when he said the mission, right? You do not want to get in the way of the mission. Well, we don't look at the mission just from the elected or the government's perspective. We look at it from the residents' perspective. When you think of how they look at a city, the first thing they're going to say is, look, I want to feel safe. So it's public safety, fire, police. The second piece is they just, especially in Minnesota, make sure the snow gets off the roads, make sure the roads are maintained, and then you get into jobs and other pieces. So in some ways that can make things a little bit difficult, right? Because people are not, when they think of their government, they're not always in the mindset of saying, well, how can my government be a part of this fight? And they're also not necessarily thinking through what that return on investment is. But I think in terms of getting residents involved, because this stuff is not going to happen if residents don't get involved, I think we can give a few examples. We have, I think we have the largest kind of solar farm, if that's what you call it. We'll call it that for today, but in the state of Minnesota, so all of our fire department, our police department, our operations and maintenance, all of that is run off of that solar farm. So all of our energy comes from that. We were able to make the case for that because we said, well, long term, you're going to get these cost benefits, and those cost benefits are going to go directly to your pocketbook, right? Because you pay taxes, you don't want your taxes to be any higher. Another thing that we had a long fight about was light rail. So, in other countries, they just say a train makes sense, right? They just say, hey, it makes sense, it's faster, it's cheaper. Well, in America, I think people know some of the politics. People say, well, you're going to be busing in, you're going to be on that train, crime's going to be coming in from a big city, this and that. One of the things we were able to say is, look, people are having issues with transportation from east to west. You put this in going north to south or south to north, however you look at it, there's going to be hubs to have more buses. Buses tend to be greener than just cars, right? And the light rail itself is greener because it gets people out of that cars, and it's sometimes a lot less stressful to just jump on that train than it is to jump in your car. So I think it's helping people understand that piece. And the other piece that comes along with that is we expect to have about $1 billion and $1.5 billion in development come from just establishment of that line. Why? Because businesses like to be along that line. They understand it's easier for people to get in that way. And then our residents get to benefit from that because that pushes down property taxes because businesses are paying more of their portion. I think the other third thing to look at, and I'll make this quick, I think when you think of the expertise of a city of our size, so 90,000, we think we're pretty big, but then you got New York, you got Cali, you got Los Angeles and other big cities, right? Well, when we talk about going systematically through and looking at how we can green out our infrastructure within the city, we don't always have the expertise for something like that. So we have MRCTI who can say, well, along this river, there's particular opportunities, or we can connect you with certain opportunities for grants, or even coming here and meeting folks like you, right, who have an understanding of that. We don't always have that expertise. So an effective way for us to kind of get around that is to either build partnerships or join coalitions that do have that expertise, that are willing to come out, and then we can start doing business and getting a better understanding of what we need to do as a city. So from a city perspective, I think that's kind of how we are beginning to approach this.
Excellent. You knocked it out of the park with that introduction. Kevin.
Terrific. Thanks. Thanks for the invitation and for being here. Yeah, very, very happy and always happy to be with America's All In. So, Mars had the privilege of being on the stage at a press conference in Marrakesh, having a discussion about how corporates and non-state actors or subnational governments were still going to be committed to the goals of the Paris Agreement, and that press conference led to We Are Still In, which then evolved into America's All In, and the reason we were there and the reason we're still here comes to exactly what Assistant Secretary Owen and Mayor Winston talked about, which is there are real problems and real challenges that we need to deal with, and the opportunity is to come up with real solutions that have exciting co-benefits, transportation, warfighting capability, resilience of supply chains, in the case of Mars, and that's why we're here, and so this work will persist and will keep going. On energy specifically, just to come back around to the purpose of the panel, I think and Bob sort of alluded to this a little bit as well. I think one of the at first glance terrifying, but then on second glance interesting things about sustainable energy solutions is, in general, they are often more capital intensive, less operationally expensive, right? So if you go back to the old days of the incandescent light bulb, they were super cheap to buy, but then you spent a lot of money running them. Now, coming through compact fluorescence and into the world of LEDs, more expensive to buy, relatively low cost to operate. And from a business point of view, capital expenditure and operational expenditure, a dollar isn't a dollar. There's a big difference there, right? So you've got to, at first you're like, I don't have enough capital to do all this, but then, you get your finance team's brains engaged and you get into like innovative financing and, off balance sheet and, some of the work that Bob does. And so I think that innovation in financial models and structures to achieve and capture some of the benefits, even on the financial side, let alone the climate benefits of things like renewable energy or even energy efficiency, is a super interesting topic. And I think one of the things that we find incredibly engaging about it is we spent a lot of time over the last 17 years of our sustainability program is figuring out how to take what looks like a sustainability problem and sort of twist it 5 degrees to the left or the right so that someone in a core historical business job goes, oh, that looks like something I've done before. And, so like we wanted to go do our first PPA and the first contract that came back was something that was going to consolidate and end up on our balance sheet. And the whole point of the PPA was that we wouldn't have to use our own capital. It'd be third-party capital, but in finance language, if it consolidates, that means it ends up on your balance sheet anyways. And we went, well, that was a pointless thought exercise until we sat down with our technical accounting manager who said, well, actually, if you changed this and this and this about the contract, then it won't consolidate on your balance sheet, right? And that was him being able to use his superpower, which is technical accounting, to contribute to a climate and sustainability, and in this case, renewable energy project. And so I think that's the exciting opportunity for engaging people. And now he gets to be part of having, enabled Mars's renewable energy journey. Probably tells more stories about that at the family barbecue than he does about the latest contract structure that's avoided derivative accounting is, right? And so super engaging for him and helping drive our progress.
Okay, great. All right, let's bring it back for a second. I want to bring it back to for those in the benefit of those in the audience that might not understand some of what you just presented in terms of how a project flow, idea may come to fruition. Who are the decision makers? Bob, maybe you can set the ground and tell us from your view, how are energy efficiency decisions, what's the status quo? How are they being made when you approach a client?
Yeah, well, first of all, have to talk about the accountants. They are a decision maker, but they might save the world. Obviously, it helped Mars, and you look at what at least the SEC has proposed in the U.S. for reporting standards, and all that could make a difference. But in terms of our projects, each and every one gets run through a capital budgeting process, so an investment decision review within a corporation or a hospital or a school. And it'll involve different stakeholders, sustainability, often facilities, and certainly finance, sometimes real estate. And projects will be compared against a hurdle rate that particularly the finance group will want to make sure that a project meets. And a hurdle rate can be a rate of return on a project or an investment. It can also be a simple payback period on a project where you take the total investment cost and you divide it by the benefits and see how many years it takes to pay for itself. All of these are metrics that are reviewed for an organization to decide should they self-fund a project or even approve it. And usually what happens on sustainable energy projects is that the payback periods are too long, at least to use internal capital. And for a lot of companies, it's anything more than 3 years, which is actually a pretty good investment, but the competition for corporate capital is tough. So a lot of these projects are rejected. And the economic review of these projects is always very narrow. For energy efficiency, it's just on the energy savings. For renewable energy, it might be just looking at the tariff differential of what someone would pay for renewable energy versus their local utility. And if they're in a low utility cost region, it's hard. And what gets omitted is all of the costs of inaction or the other benefits of doing these projects. So if you have a hospital that has an aging chiller that's going to fail, that's going to present a lot of business problems. There's going to be downtime there. If it's an industrial factory, there could be lost revenue and production. If it's equipment that fails unexpectedly, it's going to cost you sometimes 2 to 3 times more to replace it on an emergency basis. If you have to keep old equipment running and pay outside companies to come in and maintain it, all of these are real costs, and they rarely, if ever, get factored into the decision making on investments. So if organizations were to change the way they think about projects, think about the cost of inaction, not just on the investment that's in front of them, but the implications of not acting, it radically changes the economic profile. And then one other layer that admittedly is a little harder to quantify is benefits that get into the productivity or health side of sustainable energy investments. If you keep temperatures at a comfortable level in schools, students are going to be a lot more productive. There's going to be a lot of health and safety benefits for workers in indoor air temperature and air quality, and cardiovascular conditions and fewer sick days. All of that gets tougher to quantify, but they're real benefits and they get neglected. And I think if the economic picture is changed and these benefits get included, a lot more projects get approved that, again, are sitting here right today that we can act on.
You want to come in?
Yeah, I'll just say a few things. I think when we talk about from the government perspective, especially that local government perspective, I think there are some pluses. Now, while we might not always have the expertise, often when we're putting something into place, we're looking at it from a long-term perspective. So we're looking at it from 50 years, 100 years out, right? Which, companies are saying, well, I need to hit this quarterly goal or 2-year goal or 5-year goal. So we have a longer horizon to look at. So I think that's one positive. I think the other positive, and maybe people don't always think of it this way, but a lot of our staff at our city and at other cities, they're walking around with masters in public administration or environmental studies. So if you come to them and you kind of say, hey, listen, we're looking at bringing a different approach to this. Now, they may not understand it up front. You may have to walk them through some of the other cost savings or some of the other benefits or some of the other approaches, but they're probably more amenable than maybe even your average person to sitting down and saying, I understand that long term this will help with the workforce or this will help with a certain type of productivity, and this is how we can capture that as a city. I think one of the things that we are struggling with, and I think, frankly, MRCTI is struggling with, is when we talk about up and down the Mississippi corridor, there's a ton of companies that use that, but a lot of fixing that, right? Getting the money from the Inflation Reduction Act and other sources, right, to go out there, and they're actually going to go take about 100,000 acres, which is pretty big, and they're going to renature it. So that means you're reestablishing some wetlands and some forests to be able to capture more of the water so we have less drought. And when the floods hit, the floods don't hit quite as bad, and we have less floods because I want to say since 2005, we've probably lost $250 billion along that corridor, right? But the issue is that that's not just hitting our pocketbooks or other mayors that their residents are having to deal with the floods. We've got Cargill that's off the river. We've got General Mills. We've got, huge consumer packaged goods groups in Minnesota. And you say, well, this infrastructure, if that river is too low, right, you can't ship your goods out, and you're losing big money from that. So how do we get folks to buy into that rather than saying, well, this should sit on the shoulders of, I might have meant the other one, but this should sit on the shoulders of the government. It's really something that we have to come together as a group. So I think it sounds odd that the local governments might, regardless, red state, blue state, regardless, some of their staff may be more willing to say, okay, I'll sit down and deal with this and figure this out. Now, it might take longer because cities tend to plan and move a little bit longer, but they're more amenable to some of these discussions. My concern is in terms of some of this what we're seeing with climate change, how do we get everybody on board, right, all in, to make sure that everybody's paying their part of the tab so that we can get ahead of these issues.
Okay, so very interesting. Longer time horizon. Kevin, tell us about your time horizon when you're making decisions, and what sort of benefits come into the Mars calculus? I know you have the Mars compass that is a guiding the corporate actions.
Yeah, so Bob's absolutely right. The historical basis of energy decisions is on this sort of fast turnaround, high IRR, quick payback on your capital investments. But for a business like Mars that has a net zero commitment and interim targets along the way, 2025, 2030, and really any other business that has those sort of targets and commitments, it falls to us to figure out a different calculus, because we're not going to hit those targets without doing this work in renewable energy. And so if our current decision-making criteria is stopping those projects from happening, that our current decision criteria is going to stop us from hitting our goals. And there are decision criteria. We can change them. I was on a panel with someone earlier, and they said, people complain about the policies blocking this. If you're a government, you can change the policy, right? There's some constraints in how you do that, but it's not chiseled on a stone tablet, right? And so for us, what that means is we look at, we're trying to deliver year over year absolute reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions across our whole value chain, of which our factories are a small but obviously important, because it's direct to us part. And our job is not to find projects that meet some arbitrary economic hurdle. Our job is to find the most cost-effective way of delivering the amount of GHG reduction that we need to keep pace every year, right? And so the primacy is on the GHG reduction, find the lowest cost solution for doing it, not start with the economics and the carbon will end up wherever it ends up. And really for any company, and certainly all the big ones, or most of the big ones, at least in the US and in Europe, have made these sort of net zero commitments. That's the performance that we need to be driving. That's the performance that we need to be held accountable for. So we need external stakeholders, even governments, calling us out, holding us accountable for delivering those reductions, and that's what will push things forward. The other thing that unlocks is it then motivates us to get really clever about all that fancy, wonky financial engineering that I talked about in my first answer, to find smarter ways to make the economics work, and to not just look at the first answer and go, ooh, that's expensive. Well, you're going to have to do it anyways because we need the GHG numbers. Go back and get smart and find something clever. And again, maybe everyone's heard the story before, but the whole magic of like a power purchase agreement with a renewable energy asset, like a wind farm or something, is, if a wind farm goes to a bank and says, I want to build a wind farm, I'm just going to sell the power to the market, the bank's going to go, ooh, well, wind farms are sort of known things. That's not that risky, but I have no idea what you're going to get paid for that power over the next 20 years. You look risky. I'll loan you money, but it's going to be 8%. That same project comes to the bank and says, hey, I want to build a wind farm, and I've got a 20-year offtake with Mars, who's signed a contract that takes on some of that market price risk. The bank goes, all good, 6%, right? So us signing the contract with the wind farm lowers the cost for them of borrowing money, which actually means they can produce power cheaper because we're buying it, because they have a smaller interest payment to make. And that's the sort of cleverness that this provokes, and there's 10 other things sort of in that same vein where you really get into this and find a better solution. So that's the approach we've been taking, is deliver the GHG or renewables progress and find the lowest cost solution for it.
It's time to get clever. That's what you motivate your folks to find the solutions. I like it. Can we pivot to some of a success story, something that you're really proud of that would exemplify to this audience? Okay, this is a decision that was made, and it hit home. Like we realized multiple benefits in addition to the important climate benefits, be it mitigation or resilience. Floor is open to whomever would like to take a stab.
Yeah, a couple projects. One was with a group called Bristol Hospital that was having problems with their chillers. Their cooling system was failing, and we financed a new cooling and heating upgrade for them. And in that project we financed, they attributed some of the benefits or savings from not having to go out and rent spare chiller capacity when their old chillers had been failing. So it was an avoided cost for them that was real, that they'd been experiencing for many years, and they rolled that into a project we did with them. Another one, a little bit, but getting creative, is Amazon. We've financed projects that are at 56 of their different fulfillment centers, and they allowed us to look at different buildings, different fulfillment or distribution centers that maybe were thousands of miles apart from each other. And some of the projects in one distribution center had better economics, and another one in a different distribution center had worse economics. We were able to bundle them together into a series of single financings that allowed for greater impact in terms of energy savings and GHG reductions, and all of that was just their decision to think more flexibly about their real estate and how to package that into projects.
Yeah, so I'll try to keep it brief. I think one, is the solar power that our city uses, right? So it's less expensive, but also it's built some resiliency in for our personal grid. I don't know if that exists, but that's how we look at it, right? And we were able to put that together with federal tax credits, a grant from the state of Minnesota, and then I think we worked with a company named Standard Solar to make all of that happen. So that's something that we're proud of as a city, and I think we're going to be looking to expand on that. I would say throughout the state of Minnesota, when we look at just the light rail, it just faces often what feels like an uphill battle, but when it's put in place, we have to look at this from kind of a government perspective, right? And resident, is that wherever it's put in place, it generates about $1 billion of commercial property values, which has a real impact. And then less people are using their cars. So, and then after the pandemic was tough on making the case for public transportation, right? But it's starting to ramp back up to even higher than it was before. So I think those are some examples of when it actually works and when residents can actually accept the success that happened from it.
So we've talked a lot about energy and GHGs and business case and all that, and so actually maybe the example I'll give is on a different axis, which is the human axis. So you heard me talk about these long-term PPAs. So one of the ones we did was in the UK. So there's a project in Scotland that we signed a contract with in 2018, I think, something like that. Long-term contract, covers 100% of our electricity use in the UK. Great. The exciting story was there was a guy that worked with us who was the UK energy buyer, longtime Mars associate. I think he'd been with the business 30 years at that point. So we go up to Scotland for the day of the ribbon cutting, right? And they've got the community out there, and they had a contest of the kids at the local school to design a coat of arms for the wind farm, and the girl that had won, her coat of arms was 10 feet tall on the base of one of the turbines, and she got a little, it was great, right? So this guy, Dominic, who's the energy buyer at Mars, been there 30 years, right? Very sort of traditional, staid, stolid British gentleman in his 50s. Tear running down his cheek, right? And he says, "This is my best day as an associate." So that's what if you work at Mars, you're an associate. this is my best day as an associate in my entire career, right? And so yes, all the other stuff, yes, the carbon, right? But that, for him, and then, to some extent by reflection for everyone else that works at Mars. I think that's the success story that really sort of sticks with me.
Yeah, you wanna have your workforce all in towards your goals. You want to have your community supporting your decisions, and the trust that you're making the decisions with their best economic and environmental futures over the long time horizon in mind. So thank you. Did we cover everything about the cost of inaction? Yeah? Okay, right. We need to bring those in to the decision calculus. That's the take home there. Cannot forget the cost of inaction. But I would also say maybe you alluded to it a little bit, Mayor, about investing in resilience and the potential tremendous economic loss to the whole Mississippi River corridor. Is there anything more in that area in terms of looking at making investments to bolster our resilience of our communities or our operations that folks would like to share?
Yeah, I don't have a ton more to say around it. I will say that, they're planning on doing this with a company called, MRCTI is going to be doing with a company called Ducks Unlimited, so they do a lot of this restoration work. And they're doing it, right now they have 22 million. And I think people forget how large and how big the Mississippi is, but it's 10 states along that corridor. But the Mississippi River actually extends out into 31 states, right? So by saving this corridor, you're having an effect on 31 states. The other piece is that they want to expand it to more than 100,000 acres. With that 100,000 acres, I think they are saving around 360, I want to say 360,000 gallons. I can never remember the actual measure of carbon, right? So they're capturing a bunch of carbon that has been lost because we've degraded the Mississippi so much. And I think that if you have companies, private companies or Fortune 500s that invest in a coalition like that, right? Some of those carbon savings, they get to count those, right? You divide that by what you're putting, what the coalition is putting in together, the number of partners, and you're partially responsible for that work. So I think those type of coalitions are incredibly important, just to keeping these together. The other thing I'll say is this, is that Assistant Secretary Owens talked about this a little bit earlier, but in terms of just continuing this work, no matter who's in at the federal level, and I'm by no means writing off the federal level at all, because I think there's a very strong business case to be made, especially along the Mississippi, but in other areas they're dealing with their own, other regions they're dealing with similar things. But I think there's a resilience case to be made when we talk of, and a readiness, preparedness to be made based on what Assistant Secretary was saying, right? So I think though that people should realize that this work is moving forward. There's an economy that has pretty much been created from this. People are starting to get more and more advanced with it. And then cities and other partners are beginning to say, our future doesn't really work the way we want it to work without investing in it. So there's a real clear case, I think. So I think a lot of people are really concerned, and what I'm telling people is this work is going to continue at the local level, because at the local level we're saying it's just a reality we have to deal with, and the benefits that we get overall from just functioning, whether it's environmentally or whether it's economically, we're all in on this thing because we have to be all in on this thing, right? And if we look at it from a 50, 100-year perspective, which we get to do as a government, because I don't have to respond, I guess I'm accountable every 4 years, right? But I don't have to respond on a quarterly basis, at least, right? I think we can push a lot of this work forward because we have that longer horizon.
Yeah, maybe only because one of my colleagues was on a panel 2 days ago with one of your colleagues who happened to be sitting in this chair. I believe it's 160,000 tons of carbon, doubling to 320 sometime in the not too distant future. There's a mayor from Arkansas, I'm forgetting her name.
So that was Melissa
there you go.
Logan, but I can't tell her that because then she'll feel like some people were actually really
paying
listening.
attention.
Yes.
So yeah, forget I said that. Maybe I'll answer to your inaction point. So I think, and people are going to come off thinking I'm always thinking about finance, which maybe our financial controller will be pleased to hear that. But, you know, for a company like Mars, so we're a food manufacturer, obviously, energy is not a huge part of our cost structure, right? We're not steel or aluminum where it's a big part of our costs. In absolute dollars, it's still big money, but it's a small part of our cost structure. And that means that historically we didn't put a lot of strategic thinking into it. We're much more worried about managing cocoa and labor and transportation and, you know, poultry for our pet food business and, you know, packaging and things like that. And so historically our mindset is, well, we're not gonna take any risks and get real clever with our energy buying strategy because it's just not a priority for us, right? One of the things that's interesting about a lot of these sustainable energy solutions, renewable energy, is there's often this cleverness around making a long-term commitment, lowering costs, and so on and so forth. One of the arguments of the flip side of that is like, yeah, but now you've got some locked-in cost structure, which in the past we would say, I don't know if I want to go long on my cost structure. But in a changing world where we see a lot more volatility in everything, energy, food, politics, you know, having some of that security is a strategy that maybe wouldn't have been that interesting 10 or 15 years ago, but is now. You know, companies that had a long-term price commitment on a project in Europe over the last 3 or 4 years were very happy. You know, as energy prices shot up, you know, they were protected. And so I think the cost of, I don't know if you want to call it the cost of inaction or the benefit of some of that certainty that comes from some of these renewable assets is a value that we wouldn't have seen as a value, climate aside, but even just sort of the macroeconomic context, that is a real thing today.
Yeah, I think just one thing, Dad, picking up on what Kevin was saying, I think the way Mars is looking at it in a longer term, more strategic view is obviously the way to go. It's more holistic, looking at the benefits. We need more companies to do that because right now where the cost of inaction happens a lot is we'll be talking to customers and they will decide to defer an investment for a year and say, well, we'll get to it next year. And what we find is it's rare that next year ever happens. And we have customers who we've actually had them pass on a project 1 year and then 2-3 years later they come back to us, they still haven't done it and we do it then. And at that point there's energy savings that have been lost, GHG reductions that have been lost, and it's getting people to think with that longer term view is key.
Okay, well, we're in our closing moments here for this panel. It's been a great discussion. Give us one takeaway that you want the last impression of this audience to bring out into the rest of the COP29. Should I go down the line? Who should I call in first? Kevin? We'll go.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little broader than sustainable energy, but it's a point I made earlier, which is, you know, looking at the private sector, the first question whenever you talk to anybody like me is, what is your performance on GHGs? I don't care about your targets, I don't care about your investments, I don't care about your press releases, I don't care about your latest story, I don't care what panel you've been on. Tell me if you have reduced your emissions and by how much, and how much more are you going to do next year. That's the thing to drive, because at the end, that's all that matters to the climate. Molecules up and down, right? Everything else is noise. Some of it's useful noise, but the climate's deaf. It doesn't hear any of that. The noise is for us, right? The climate counts molecules, and that's really the thing to be driving. And the point of pressuring us, the private sector, on that is that's what'll drive the work and the projects at scale. That's what'll drive people to go do deals with Bob. That's what'll drive people to do PPAs. That'll drive people to get supportive of MRCTI, is when we need to deliver progress.
Yeah, I guess I would I would actually agree with that. Takeaway is that we have to really lean into the actual actions or results and measuring those results. And I think, you know, where you put your eye, you're able to generally make it work economically over time, especially if you have kind of the world trying its very best to move in the same direction. you'll find solutions, you'll find the cost savings, you'll find ways to make it work. But there has to be a very real intent, and there has to be an understanding that it cannot be driven simply by short term, because there are some long-term results that we need out of that will, if ignored, just make you irrelevant. And I think if we look at Mississippi River, we look on the coasts across the world and the things that people are dealing with, there are some things here that can immediately just change somebody's business model overnight, or just destroy that business model because of what we're facing. And I hate to speak like that, but I would say that taking that longer perspective to drive at those actual effects or outcomes, I think is going to be key.
A key takeaway is that there's a lot of talk of different technology advances, new policies that are needed, and obviously all of that is important in the fight against climate change. But there's also a lot of projects out there in the world of energy efficiency that use well-proven, very low-risk technologies that are sitting right there in front of us, and they're quick and easy to implement. And if you look at what it would take for the U.S. to hit its GHG reduction targets under the Paris Agreement, 50% of it can come from energy efficiency, and there's no major technology advance that's needed there. These are projects we can move on, and to me, that's the definition of action.
All right. I'd like to take the time to thank you all for joining us today, Assistant Secretary Owens. We appreciate your time, and this concludes today's discussion.